All right. Hello, everybody. I am so sorry. Are we starting? Okay. Okay. Um, Hi, everybody. I am so sorry about everything. Hopefully, you guys have been able to find your way over here from YouTube and Twitter. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I have no idea what's going on, but YouTube is not my friend today. So we are back over here on Facebook, and hopefully some of you guys are able to still join me. Um, Sorry for the frazzling. Hi, okay, good. People are starting to come over here. Um, so, thank you so much. And today we're here to talk about Jane Austen and romantic comedies. I'm going to give people just a couple of minutes to kind of make their way over here. Hopefully, the virtual JaneCon folks, there we go, are starting to make their way over and posting it on other social media. So we're just going to hang out for a minute or two, let folks get over here, and then we'll be good to go. Hello, hi guys. Thank you. Um, so anyway, basically today we're going to talk a little bit about Jane Austen and romantic comedies because let's be honest, we hear those two things put together an awful lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean they actually go together. Because you watch Bridgerton, and how many of us saw the 50,000 articles where they say, oh, watch Bridgerton, it's the sexy Jane Austen. But they have the period in common, but not nearly as much as we might think. But we still talk about Austen often through the lens of romance or romantic comedy if we're talking in the more modern sense of the word. So I want to talk a little bit about where we're coming with that and what's going on. So the important thing to start out with is understanding what exactly is a romance and why before we can even talk about why Jane Austen is or isn't it. So I am a teacher. I have flashcards. So there's two major components that you absolutely have to have in a romance. So this is basically borrowed from the literary world where we talk about romance novels. So number one, the romance is the central plot. This is, you literally cannot define a romance story, romance book, romance movie, any of that without having that be the central part of the plot. That's what separates us from a story that has a romantic subplot in it, but isn't necessarily a romance in and of itself. And we're going to come back to that in a minute because that's really important when we're talking about Jane Austen. And the other component, happily ever after, happy for now. You cannot have a romance that doesn't have some sort of a happily ever after, happily ever little ways. That's why, for instance, that we don't necessarily talk about Nicholas Sparks movies or Nicholas Sparks books as romance because they're not always the happily ever after. And you have to have both of those components for us to consider something a romance. When we add romantic comedy, you have to add the romance is funny. Again, the romance is funny, not just the movie or the book itself. That's, again, what separates us from a comedy with romance versus a romantic comedy. It's about the comic situations that surround some sort of a romantic arc. So, where does that leave us with Jane Austen? We're really not, there's not as much overlap as we think. So in some of the books we have, number one, the romance is central. In pretty much all of the books we have happily ever after. And in a couple of them we have the romance is funny. But there's really only one Austen novel that seems to even come close to meeting all three of those requirements. And I think we all know what it is because it's in the title of my talk. It's these guys. You've got pretty much everything that goes into a classic romantic comedy in there. You've got the bickering couple. You've got all the oddball things, the crazy antics that happen in between them. You've got the misunderstandings. You've got just the right amount of drama. You've got the secondary couple. You've got the centrality of the romance. You've got all these things put together. And so it comes close to being what we would consider a romantic comedy. But let's talk about some of the other ones because when we go through those, you'll find that a lot of them have one or two of these components maybe, but not all of them. So for instance, let's do Sense and Sensibility. So if we pull out, I have the handy DVD cover, even looking at the marketing up here, we can see what this one's about. It's mainly the two sisters, and that Hugh Grant was one of the more famous members of the cast at the time this movie came out. But it's really about the two sisters. It's not necessarily a comedy as much. It really has the least amount of time even spent on the love stories. The love story that gets the most page time, screen time, however you want to put it, is the one that doesn't work out, right? So that definitely is not a romance central, and it's definitely not one where the romance is funny. All we get is a happily ever after. Emma is not really a romance either, right? What Emma is about, Emma figuring out how to be a better person, aka it doesn't really matter how rich you are and fabulous and how many baskets you bring to somebody if you're still a jerk to them at the picnic. Sorry. We got Mansfield Park, which is, again, making fun a little bit of the pretentious, self-absorbed, wealthy. And it's also kind of exhibit A for the moral of most Austen stories, which is please, please, please do not go for the bad boy who claims he is reformed, because guess what? He isn't, and he'll run off with your cousin the second that he doesn't get his way. Which is also another way that Austen doesn't necessarily go along with what we typically think of as a romantic comedy, because how many romantic comedies have the heroine choosing the bad boy and he changes for her and all of these things? Yeah, no, that's not where Austen's going. That's not where we're going here. Northanger Abbey, well, we've got the humor. It's straight up Gothic satire, but it's not necessarily a romantic comedy. The romance part of it isn't particularly funny, right? I mean, except Henry Tilney is an absolute troll, bless his little heart, but that's about it. And Persuasion isn't even a comedy at all unless you enjoy Sir Walter being a dum-dum. So we've got all these different things that are all pulled together, and yet in pop culture we're still talking about it as if it's a romantic comedy. We lump these things in together. But so really, why is that? So I don't know if you guys have any ideas on why that is. Please feel free to share them in the chat. I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can tell me if you disagree or not. So the number one thing simply is the idea that there's a perception that if a piece of art is for women, especially if it's by women, for women, and it has any whiff of romance in it, it's romance. It absolutely has to be. It's very much a pigeonholing, similar to how anything that's popular among teenage girls, for instance, let's say music, pop music, any artist who's popular with a young female fan base will tend to get pigeonholed as bubblegum, pop music, not helpful, anything like that, not valid music. And so by categorizing Jane Austen as romance or romantic comedy, we can really easily brush off having to talk about it as literature. Oh my God, it's about women's lives and marriage and sisterhood and all of that. That's not literature. That's women's fiction. That's romance. And so we end up with that getting passed down through a couple hundred years, and then here we sit. But there's also the Pride and Prejudice of it all. There's the Mr. Darcy of it all. So because Pride and Prejudice is probably the most popular out of all the Austen novels, the most well-known outside of people who actually sit down and read all the Austen novels, it gets kind of put out there as the flagship, so to speak. It's the representative of Austen for everybody else. And because it happens to be the most romantic comedy-esque, I think, we end up with people who think, oh, it's all like that. Devaney was talking about it in the previous video, if you guys were in that chat, about the light, bright, and sparkling, right? The idea that this was her lightest novel, her brightest novel. It's fizzy. It's a romantic comedy, which is, those are adjectives we use to describe rom-coms even today. So when we're talking about that, we can kind of actually draw a pretty good line from classic rom-coms like Much Ado About Nothing. It's pretty much the epitome of the Western rom-com, and we can trace it straight to Pride and Prejudice. You've got the main couple for us as an audience isn't the main couple for the people in the story. They're too busy focusing on somebody else, while these two guys are over here arguing with each other all the time. But we care more about Jane and Bingley in the story, but the audience cares more about Lizzie and Darcy, and we know that. You've got the main couple hating each other for good reasons, but they're also each other's perfect match and they just have to overcome their own flaws for it. You've got somebody outside messes with their friend's relationship and it affects their relationship too. All of that, all of those things are textbook 20th century romantic comedies. Look at any 90s movie, any one of these romantic comedies, and you've got stuff like that. You've got the main couple, supporting couple setup, all of these things. So is Pride and Prejudice a romantic comedy? I don't know. What do you guys think? It definitely has some of the elements of it. It definitely has most of the factors that we talked about at the beginning. But is it really a romantic comedy as we would talk about it today? Well, don't know if we would classify the book itself as, but we definitely can talk about some of the adaptations of Austen, and this is where we really start to get that crossover into romantic comedy land, right? We really start to see things like Bridget Jones. So, oh, the audio keeps cutting in and out. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. If that keeps happening, please let me know, guys. It should be okay. I've got, yeah, okay. Just let me know if that keeps happening. Thank you for letting me know that. Yes, women's fiction, whatever that means. And that's really something that we can talk about a lot, because what really does make it women's fiction versus just, fiction, bestseller, whatever. You walk into a Barnes & Noble and what do you see on the different racks? We pay attention to that. Yeah, Rachel, I definitely have been advertised books as romances and have been confused about why they called it that. Yeah, exactly. So we have this dichotomy too between how do we use the term romance. You've got romance with a capital R as in a genre. You've got romance over here as with a lowercase r as, let's say, more of a descriptive word. And when we can't tell the difference between the two, or when there's deliberately ambiguous marketing of it, which is more of a problem, then that's when we end up with things like this, where we call everything that has a romantic plot line a romance, and then wonder why people are confused, or vice versa. But when we start borrowing things from romance, we also have to keep in mind that Austen's work is unabashedly romantic. There are beautiful love stories, beautiful, beautiful confessions of love. Me, I'm partial to Wentworth's letter. Oh, that doesn't get better than that. But it's not just that, and that's not always the priority of the story. If we're really thinking about it, Austen's work is more about society as a whole and class and gender and the way that those things intersect. Romance in these novels is intrinsically linked to class in every single one of these Austen novels, whereas it's not necessarily a required element in a romantic comedy. Although we're going to come back to that in a moment, because even though it's not required, it kind of has become a required element in contemporary rom-coms. So we're going to need to break that down a little bit. But let's talk about the idea of class in these novels. So every single one of Austen's heroines